Hi guys, and welcome back. So in the last video, we kind of talked about at a very high level what a resource definition looks like and how you can kind of find a resource template in the documentation for Kubernetes, as well as how to use the API reference documentation to actually figure out all of the different supported properties for each type of resource in your cluster. Now, if you're not sure which types of resources and which API versions your cluster supports, depending on what version of Kubernetes you're currently running on your cluster, I wanted to show you a couple of commands that you can use to actually dynamically determine which supported API versions and API resources are available. So if you've already got your cluster set up and you run the kubectl command line utility here, the kubectl command line utility allows you to have a bunch of control over deploying resources, deleting resources, monitoring your cluster health, and things like that. But there's a couple of kind of meta commands in kubectl that allow you to discover which types of API groups and API resources are supported on your server. And that is going to be these two subcommands right down here. So API versions, this is going to show you the different API groups that are installed on your cluster. And there's a whole bunch of core API groups that are installed with Kubernetes, but you can also install third-party APIs as well that install their own different API versions as well. So this allows us to query our Kubernetes master nodes, specifically the API server, and it allows us to figure out dynamically which API versions or API groups are supported for the specific cluster that we're talking to. So if I run kubectl API versions, let me fix that with the S there, you can see that we get back a list of a bunch of different API versions here. These are also known as API groups in the Kubernetes environment, in the ecosystem. And so each of these API groups defines different types of resources. So one of the API versions that you're going to find here is called V1. And anytime that you see just a V1 here, it's actually referring to a core API group. And if we take a look back over at the documentation for the pod spec, for example, if you take a look at a pod spec, you can actually see that a pod belongs to the core API group, and it has a version of V1. So if you just see an API version on your server over here in your terminal called V1, that's actually referring to the core API group, even though it's not explicitly mentioned in that name. You're not actually going to see an API group here with the name core anywhere, but when you see core referenced in the API docs for Kubernetes, that's referring over to the just V1 API group. Now, the V1 API group, along with all of these other API groups, can define different types of resources, and those are actually documented here under the API reference documentation as well. So for example, let's take a look at something like a cron job. So if you want to run a pod on a schedule, for example, you can create this special type of resource in Kubernetes called a cron job. And if you take a look at the authoritative reference documentation for the cron job resource, you're going to see that the cron job actually belongs to a different API group called batch. So if we come back to our terminal here and kind of look through our list of API groups here that are exposed on our server, and you scroll down through the list, eventually you'll see that there is a batch/v1 API group. And there's actually a second one here as well called batch/v1 beta 1. And so if there are beta features that are being added by the team that's responsible for the batch API group, they could actually define those under a separate group called V1 beta instead of putting it under V1, which is reserved more for production quality resources that are actually ready to be released into the larger ecosystem and therefore production use. But if you want to, if you're an API developer for Kubernetes and you want to kind of beta test or alpha test a feature, oftentimes you'll see those exposed under different alpha or beta API groups instead of under a V1 API group. And so depending on which type of resource you're trying to deploy, those will fall under different types of resource groups, or API groups such as batch or core or storage, for example, and things like that. So these are kind of API level groupings. But then if you want to actually take a look at what API resources are supported under each of these API groups, you can actually take a look at the other command in kubectl, which is API resources. And when you run kubectl API resources, let me bump down the font size a little bit here so we can read this a little bit more easily. But what you're going to see is that the resource types that you get back here are actually associated with a particular API version or API group, depending on what you want to call it. So if you take a look at pods here, for example, the pod belongs again to that core v1 group. Same thing with things like namespaces. So if you create a namespace on your Kubernetes cluster, that belongs to a v1 group as well, the core v1 group. But then you've got other types of resources. We talked about things like cron jobs. That belongs to batch v1. You've also got jobs here as well, which are not necessarily executed on cron expressions, but they're just async jobs that run on your Kubernetes cluster. And those also are defined under the batch/v1 API group. You're going to have other types of resources as well, things like ingress controllers, for example, ingress classes, as well as the ingress configurations themselves. And things like that operate at network layer 7, so you're doing kind of HTTP level routing based on things like host names and URL paths and things like that. And so because that is considered a networking concept, those types of resources actually fall under a totally separate API group called networking. So understanding the association between a particular type of resource and the API group that it belongs to is going to help you as you're building out your manifest files for Kubernetes, because those are the values that you're actually going to be plugging in for API version or API group. And then for kind, that's going to be the actual resource type over here on the left-hand side that you want to deploy. So if you wanted to deploy something like a deployment controller, well, the resource type or the kind would be deployments. So I would come in here to my manifest and change that to deployments. And then under my API version here, I would actually plug in the API version that it belongs to. So if we kind of follow this line over to the right-hand side, you can see that the deployments resource type actually belongs to apps/v1. So under API version, that would be apps/v1. And then for the resource kind, that would be deployments. And that's how I would define a deployment controller. However, because I'm actually changing this from a pod to a deployment controller, the spec for the deployment controller is going to look completely different from a pod. So I would have to either go find some example documentation for how to define a deployment controller, or I could head over to the reference documentation and actually figure out how to construct a deployment controller from scratch. But the main point that I wanted to get across is that there are different API groups and different resource types or kinds that belong to those API groups. And that's kind of how you can define different types of resources on your cluster. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.